Theodicy. But while I could stop here, these observations, I think, raise some more general questions about how we are to think about Leibniz's thought and the systematic connections among its parts. And so I would like to continue on a little bit farther and talk a bit about that. And let me step back, in fact, outside of Leibniz and talk a little bit about a couple of other philosophical systems in the earlier part of the 17th century, beginning with Descartes. In the introduction to the French translation of the Principles, he presents his famous tree metaphor. The whole of philosophy is like a tree. The roots are metaphysics, the tree is physics, and the branches emerging from the trunk are all the other sciences, which may be reduced to three principal ones, namely medicine, mechanics, and morals. And for Descartes, as the metaphor suggests, the parts of philosophy are very carefully structured and closely connected. Take the connection between the roots and the trunk, the metaphysical foundations and the physics. For Descartes, the essence of body is extension, and it's distinct from mind, something he establishes in Meditation 6. From this we can infer, for example, that the world is a plenum, that there is no vacuum in nature. For the laws of nature, which Descartes presents in part 2 of the Principles, we need to know that God exists and sustains the world from moment to moment, something we learn in Meditation 3. Without these essentials, we can't get physics off the ground. Physics depends in a strong way, the trunk depends in a strong way on the roots. You can't do physics without having the metaphysics established first. And this was Descartes' complaint against Galileo's two new sciences in a famous letter that he wrote to Mersenne. Generally speaking, I find that he philosophizes much more ably than is usual, but he continually digresses and he does not take time to explain matters fully. This, in my view, is a mistake. It shows he has not investigated matters in an orderly way and has merely sought explanations for some particular effects without going into the primary causes in nature. Hence, his building lacks a foundation. Building without order, without foundation, without a metaphysical foundation, Galileo doesn't have the kind of solid account of nature that Descartes thinks that his own system provides. And for that reason, he doesn't think that Galileo has really established anything in physics. Unfair, but there you are. That's Descartes' conception of what a philosophical system should be. Spinoza is another example of a philosopher who was systematic in this very strong sense. There are many debates in the literature about why he chose the geometrical method for his ethics, but whatever the reason or reasons, it shows a commitment to the tight interconnectedness of his thought. In the ethics, the later propositions are dependent upon the earlier ones, and at least in principle, cannot be established without them. While we do sometimes teach parts 3 or 4 without the earlier ones, strictly speaking, moral psychology or politics, given in these sections, cannot be understood without appreciating the grounding that precedes that in parts 1 and 2. What about Leibniz? Well, Bertrand Russell famously thought that Leibniz's philosophy had a tight deductive structure much like Spinoza's, and in the opening chapter of his critical exposition, he wrote, "The philosophy of Leibniz, though never presented to the world as a systematic whole, was nevertheless, as a careful examination shows, an unusually complete and coherent system. The reasons why Leibniz did not embody his system in one great work are not to be found in the nature of that system. On the contrary, it would have lent itself far better than Spinoza's philosophy to a geometrical deduction from definitions and axioms." And so in the book, Russell tries to do what Leibniz didn't, quote, "to attempt a reconstruction of the system which Leibniz should have written, to write the Philosophia Leibniziana Modo Geometrico that Leibniz never wrote." Russell didn't succeed, nor could he have. Leibniz just wasn't a systematic thinker in the sense of Descartes or Spinoza. Though there are interconnections between the various parts of his thought, they remain for Leibniz relatively autonomous domains. that can be investigated independently of one another. I've noted the relative independence of the Theodicy project and the Monadology project, the two labyrinths that he was talking about at the beginning of the Theodicy. But there are other places where he acknowledges the independence of different domains. And there is, I won't read it, but there is that long passage from section 10 of the Discourse on Metaphysics, where he says, you know, you can do physics without resolving the problem of the composition of the continuum. You can talk about moral philosophy or jurisprudence without resolving the problem of God's providence and so on. These are domains that can be treated somewhat independently of one another. This is not to say that these other questions aren't interesting and important, and indeed even interconnected with geometry or physics or moral philosophy or jurisprudence. It's just that they're discrete problems that can be treated independently. When we look at Leibniz's larger intellectual profile, the lesson is, I think, even more striking. When we, as philosophers or historians of philosophy, look at Leibniz, it's primarily at the parts of his thought that are more narrowly philosophical in our modern sense, at his theodicy or metaphysics, as we're doing today, or at his logic or philosophy of language, or perhaps his political philosophy. There it's tempting to look for the threads that bind these different domains together and allow us to see the underlying structure that pulls them together into a coherent and tight system. But I don't think he was that kind of a philosopher. The folly of seeing him in this way is made more apparent when we consider that Leibniz was someone who was deeply involved in numerous other domains, in technical mathematics, in jurisprudence, in geology, medicine, and alchemy, in optics, in history and historiography, in comparative linguistics, in practical politics, and no doubt many other things. In his Éloge, Fontenelle wrote that Leibniz, like the ancient charioteer, who had the skill to drive up to 8 horses harnessed abreast, drove all of the sciences abreast. Some of these domains are related to others, to be sure, some more closely than others, but some of them float pretty much free of others. Russell, thinking primarily of his more narrowly philosophical thought, has suggested a deductive connection among the domains of Leibniz's thought. I think that this is too restrictive. More recently, Michel Serres has suggested the analogy of a net, somewhat looser and less linear and one-directional. But even this may be too restrictive. The net analogy suggests that every node of Leibniz's thought is somehow connected with every other node, either directly or indirectly. But it seems to me that Leibniz's thought is perhaps more like the night sky. Some stars tightly clustered into galaxies, some more loosely into constellations, some shining independently, isolated from the others. Maybe this analogy is a bit extravagant, but the idea is clear enough. It is a distortion to want to see more order and connection in Leibniz's thought than there really is there. But what about the monadology? I've been discussing why Leibniz didn't include much of the monadological metaphysics in the Essai de Théodicy. In that context, I rejected the explanation that he did so simply because he was uncomfortable publishing his private metaphysical views, fearing that they would be misunderstood. And I've been emphasizing instead that the monadological metaphysics is missing largely because those doctrines are simply irrelevant to the project of the book. But we still need to explain why Leibniz didn't publish the monadological metaphysics anywhere. As I said at the very beginning, Leibniz's correspondent, Nicolas Raymond, complained, and rightly so, that all we got were obscure hints of the view. Why was that? And I'd like to end by speculating on some possible reasons. Leibniz develops the details of his new monadological metaphysics mostly in letters.